It's been a minute since we've talked much realignment, right? And it's bound to happen. Season ends. Realignment season never really totally ends, but we did get a pretty quiet season there for a while, actual football season. But because of a Twitter space and Ross Dellinger, we've got a little bit of a tease here that there could be some real winds of change happening in the ACC sooner than was previously thought. Honestly, I find it, and I know that this channel does a lot of realignment talk, and a lot of the way this channel blew up was about conference realignment. That's all fair, and it is certainly fascinating and interesting, but there was a part of the season being quiet that was honestly refreshing in not having to deal with a whole lot of that talk, but you knew it would come back around. We're still doing this song and dance of like waiting in the ACC on Florida State, Clemson, North Carolina. Like, what are those schools going to do? How long will they actually sit around in the ACC? When will things change? We've got lawsuits going on. They were getting very down and dirty there for a minute. You know, within the last year, we had the nepotism claims by Florida State with the former ACC commissioner, Jim Swafford, and then I was going to say impassioned. I don't know. Was Jim Phillips really like impassioned? That's probably fair. You know, Jim Phillips being somewhat combative at the podium at ACC Media Days. He's trying to stick up for his league. You know, you had like 4 different lawsuits going on in 2 different states at one point between the conferences, and then Clemson and Florida State, North Carolina sort of just there lurking. Just giving you like a recap here on all of the drama that was going on. And, you know, frankly, it felt inevitable that the schools were going to leave. And it really culminated like around Big 12 Media Days when there were whispers like, is the Big 12 actually like trying to get into this for Florida State, Clemson? And I interviewed Ross Dellinger at Big 12 Media Days, and he said his assumption was that there had been some talks there. Not that anybody felt like that was a likelihood to happen, but it at least came into college football's most connected reporter to say that he felt like there probably had been some level of conversation there between Yormark and them, as in Clemson and Florida State, trying to cover all bases. And so that blew up and turned into a storyline. Well, then in September, we got this. And this was somewhat of a bombshell at the time, but it was I was pulling this from an ESPN story. I don't want to misquote who had the initial report on this, if it was Pete Thamel or not. But it said talks between Clemson, Florida State, and the ACC have ramped up in recent weeks. This is September 16th. Talks between Clemson, Florida State, and the ACC have ramped up in recent weeks, according to sources, on a proposal that would allot a greater share of revenue to schools based on brand valuation and TV ratings, as well as potentially alter the expiration of the league's grant of rights, which currently runs through 2036, in exchange for the Tigers and Seminoles dropping their lawsuits. So basically, the ACC has already had this pay structure set up based on, you know, an incentivized structure. Like, if you perform better during the season, you'll make more money. Now they're saying, hey, cut us a deal. You guys have been preaching about your brand value and the TV ratings. Fine. We'll pay you more money, disproportionate to the rest of the league based on what your ratings will be and the revenue that you bring to the conference that way. Plus, we'll figure out some way to get out of this grant of rights before 2036, which, you know, seems like a ridiculously long time right now, over a decade. We'll figure out a way to cut that off shorter if you guys just chill with the lawsuits, chill with the billable hours, stop costing everybody a ton of money with these nasty, nasty lawsuits. Rest of the article said, according to multiple sources within the league, the conversations are preliminary. The sides are not close to an agreement. The proposal was discussed by the league's presidents, includes additional money going to schools with better ratings and success in football and basketball. And administrators from a few more than a half dozen schools who spoke with ESPN said they'd at least be open to some altered revenue split. And then the season happened, and then we really haven't heard anything for a while. When that came out, at the time, the narrative was kind of like, all right, well, that probably kills any thought of the Big 12 being the like emergency landing spot for Clemson and FSU, right? If they're going to get things worked out with the ACC enough to where they can get some extra money for the TV value that they bring and make the grant of rights a little bit more palatable, come to a compromise there, probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense to then go up and leave for just a little while to jump into the Big 12 while you wait for the Big 10 or the SEC. That's where we all were. Now, Ross Dellinger, and again, Shout out to Greg Flugar and his live stream earlier today for alerting me to this. But this is the world we live in today. Ross Dellinger was on a Twitter Spaces for Wolf Sports. Not trying to say anything about Wolf Sports at all, but Ross Dellinger made that bit of news when he came on my YouTube channel, and now it's a Twitter Space where we're pulling a quote from him. But that's the world we live in today. He said, quote, "The next big significant moment in college sports as far as realignment is concerned is 2031. It's when 2 of the 4 TV deals come to an end. That's the Big 12 and the Big 10. The SEC's comes up 3 years later. The ACC's comes up about 5 years later, but that could change. You could actually have it where 3 of the 4 power leagues could come open around 2031. So it's lending credence back to that report that came out in September, like, hey, there are discussions going on here about working out a deal with Florida State and Clemson where you would chop the grant of rights almost in half in terms of what's left now. And if 2031 then becomes the date, that's significant because you're right around Big 12 and Big 10. And if you have that much of a shift where it's, 3 of the 4 power conferences that are left all have new TV deals, well, then that's a time where a lot of movement can happen. And so this definitely furthers the idea that that could be the next time where you're looking at a lot of movement happening, which does seem like in some ways forever from now, 2031. But Dellinger threw this on the end, said if that's the case, about 2027 or 2028, you'll start to have conversations about that, which makes sense because we know how these things move. Like Texas, Oklahoma started their combos in 2021, and it wasn't until the 2020, that was July 21, and then fall 24 is when they were actually playing football in the SEC. So it does take time. You've got a lot of buildup, a lot of lead time on these things. So really, if that's the case and you're going to get 3 of the 4 leagues changing in 2031, it would be like you'd start to get the preamble to that maneuvering, things happening in 27 and 28. And now, we're January of 25. So that's seems a little more understandable. Like we would only be like 2 or 3 years away from that. Now, realignment season never sleeps. I know some have talked about like more whispers about what's going on in North Carolina right now and what could possibly happen there. I can't profess to be super in the know about that right now. Obviously, the mood from everybody in the ACC seemed to be very impatient, but I just felt like hadn't heard much during the actual football season. And the last thing we got publicly in terms of something really significant was that article in September that made it seem like, hey, this is probably where it was going. And now Ross Dellinger has dropped this quote being like, yeah, probably something you will see happen. Don't quote Ross on that. I am paraphrasing, but that's me reading between the lines like, hey, decent chance that this happens. So maybe we do get a bit of a quiet period realignment wise here. Maybe we do. I will do a little bit more digging into North Carolina. I know like TJ College Football Addiction had asked about that earlier, but I don't ever profess to be super inside sources guy, especially when it comes to realignment, because that's just really hard. Like realignment is really, really hard. That's a little bit different than just being like a beat reporter for a team or something, right? I'm always going to react to the news, give you my opinion, my take on things, where I think things may be headed. But I did find this to be significant where it's like, okay, seems like this may still be on track. The ACC still working hard on making this happen. That's the vibes. All I can give you, I forgot I had that note jotted down, just vibes. The vibes right now have felt like it tapered off a bit from like this crazy, we've got to go now from FSU, Clemson, and North Carolina to, all right, the season is starting. We need to focus on football. The ACC is going to try and cut us a deal. So the vibes had felt to be a little bit more like, all right, we can chill for a minute. Plus, the other thing that's happening right now for all these schools is like, if there is a 2-year gap before we really start talking about this again, they need to figure out revenue sharing. You've got this Title IX suit that's coming in now, the Title IX challenge to how revenue sharing was set up. Everybody is still wondering how the clearinghouse will work for NIL deals. And like, will it be something that really shuts down NIL deals if they're not like totally, quote unquote, legit? How is that going to work with all of this? there's still a lot to be sorted through and figured out, to be honest, for these schools to have to deal with. And then, oh, by the way, if you want to keep your defensive coordinator, you might have to pay him $3.1 million a year just to get him there. So there is a lot on everybody's plate right now, which makes me wonder if that would be a part of the reason that realignment takes a bit of a backseat for the time being. But I mean, I could be totally off. That could change. That could literally change tomorrow. Bob Bowlesby will never forget it. I was at Big 12 Media Days in 2021 when Bob Bowlesby, literally like a week before Texas and Oklahoma, that story broke. He was up there on the podium saying, yeah, I think realignment's going to it'll be a little while before that comes up again. And then a week later, complete crisis mode. So who knows?